Alright, so I decided to make a video because a lot of my friends and family know me as a total book nerd, and that's because I read way more than I should. But sometimes they'll ask me, what is your all time favorite book? Or what are your top 10 favorite books? And I never know how to answer that because I can tell you my top 50 or my top 100 favorite books, but to bring it down to 10 just seems impossible because there's just so many great books out there. But I thought about it, and I love when someone gives me a good book recommendation or tells me their favorite book because then I want to read it. So I decided, you know what, I'll create a list of my 10 favorite books in order and go ahead and make a video and share those books and why they're my favorite. So I'll go ahead and start with number 10 and just work my way down. So, number 10 on the list is a book called Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. And Matthew Walker's been doing research on sleep for over 25 years. And he has his own research laboratory at a university. So he talks about a lot of the studies he's done over the years on sleep. And he covers a lot of other studies that have been done over the past few decades, including longitudinal studies where they look at a large group of people over 20, 30, 40 years, and they look at the effects of their quantity and quality of sleep on their health, quality of life, and other important factors. So there's just so many amazing findings in those studies that I highly recommend that book. He also explains non sleep, REM sleep, non REM sleep, and REM sleep, deep sleep, why we dream. So, all these really important factors in our sleep. And, we sleep so much of our life that I think it's pretty fascinating thing to learn about. And there's no one better than to learn from him. So, highly recommend that book. I came across him actually he was a guest speaker on a podcast, and he was just blowing my mind away from all that he had to share about sleep. And so I had to check out his book, and it turned out to be even better than I expected. So, highly recommend. Number 9 on the list is a book called Together: The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. And so, by the way, I don't have every book on me because I check them out from the library sometimes and I return them when I'm done reading. So I just took a picture on my iPad. But Together is written by Vivek Murthy. He was the 19th Sergeant General of the U.S. So he's already done a lot of good for this country. But in this book, he actually published it in April of 2020. So he gives some really cool advice on how to maintain good social relationships during COVID and during this time of quarantine and social distancing. But in addition to that, he covers a lot of research, specifically some really interesting research on loneliness and depression and anxiety and how they're interrelated, and a lot of studies that show how we can go about maintaining or creating better social relationships in our lives so that we have a more happy and fulfilling life. And I think we learn well through stories as well. And he covers a lot of stories in this book as well about people who maybe were suffering from loneliness and depression and what they did to create more meaningful social relationships in their life. And so, just a fascinating read that I highly recommend. So, that is number 9 on the list. Number 8 is a book called Showboat, and it's written by Roland Lazarby, and it's all about Kobe Bryant. He also wrote a really good book on Michael Jordan, but it's a very massive book, over 600 pages, but it's also a super quick read because it's so interesting. And I read this book shortly after Kobe passed, so I think it was even more emotional for me in a good way. But it was super interesting just to read about Kobe's whole life growing up and kind of what made him become the man he was and the fierce competitor he was. So, just a fascinating book. I'm a little bit biased because I was such a big Kobe fan growing up, but if you're a Kobe fan or an NBA fan, I highly recommend that book. And then number 7 on the list is a book called Anti Cancer, and so the he's a medical doctor, and the author who wrote this book, he did a lot of research on the brain, and unfortunately, when he was testing out the MRI machine with his colleagues, he went under the scanner, and they actually weren't even looking for a tumor or anything, but they happened to see a tumor on his brain. And so that's how he found out. And he goes to the doctor, and it turns out to be a pretty aggressive brain tumor. And so he's only given a few years to live, but he decides to go out and find all the research he can about treating cancer, preventing cancer, anything he can get his hands on. And so it shows in the book. If you go to the reference pages, there's over 60 pages of references, meaning the whole book is just filled with research articles that are super interesting. I mean, it's a book that I wish I read 10 years ago because I wish I knew that all there is on cancer prevention with natural behaviors. And so learned so much, and I think you can learn quite a bit about not only cancer but your immune system and how you can really bolster up your immune system, especially during this time of COVID where it helps to have everything we have in our power to strengthen our immune system. So very good book. Number 6 on the list is a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. He's a medical doctor who worked with PTSD patients and trauma patients, and he found that he could give really good results in people who have maybe seen other therapists and it just didn't work out for them. And he started using more newer treatments that showed to be pretty effective. And so he talks about something called EMDR that a lot of people probably haven't heard of, but it's shown to be very effective. And he explains why it's so effective. He talks about the human brain and how the brain changes with trauma, and how once you really understand that, then you can really see how certain treatments are so effective. And so he teaches a lot about different treatments that therapists use and that can be very effective. And so I was blown away by some of the things that I learned from that book. The next book is called How Not to Die by Dr. Michael Greger. And he's a great author. He donates all the money he makes from books to charity because he really does have the purpose of helping others and getting more knowledge out there to the public. And so he spent years traveling to med schools to teach aspiring doctors all about nutrition because he realized that med schools don't cover nutrition enough. So doctors don't have enough knowledge to really give patients the advice they need on how to eat in addition to all the drugs they're prescribing patients. So that book is filled with research articles. It's kind of cool. He starts each chapter with each chapter covers like the most common cause of death. So he starts with heart disease. The next chapter is on cancer. Then it goes down diabetes, stroke, different things that are chronic illnesses that cause death. So he talks about all the research showing how to prevent them, and a lot of research on people that were able to reverse those chronic diseases. So very fascinating book that I highly recommend. All right, so number 4 on the list is a book called Unbroken by Lauren Hillenbrand. And it's an amazing World War II book. For quite a while, this is my all-time favorite book because it's just so inspiring. This story of a man who suffered so much, but just his will to survive and live helped him to get through the impossible. And they've made a couple movies after it, and so it's just a fascinating book. I don't want to ruin it because it's just so amazing, but I highly, highly recommend that book. Number 3 on the list is a book called Atomic Habits by James Clear. And so I've read this book 3 times. I recommend it to a lot of my friends that are curious about what book to read because he gives so many practical tips, and he does a great job of explaining the psychology of why we develop habits, whether they're good or bad. And once you really understand that, he's able to point you out into practical ways of how to get rid of bad habits and how to promote good habits that are long lasting and sustaining. So fascinating book that I've been able to apply and really change a lot of areas of my life. And over the past year of just doing that, I've seen big changes, not only in my behaviors, but in getting results. So awesome book that I highly recommend. I say that a lot, but I recommend all of these books, of course. The Master Plan by Chris Wilson. Not a lot of people I've talked to have heard of this book, but highly, highly recommend. I told my mom about it, and she read it, and every other day it seemed she was crying because it's kind of an emotional roller coaster, but it is just a remarkable story. And I guarantee they'll make a movie within a couple years because it is so incredible. But I think it's really important to hear a story from someone who went to prison and kind of that experience of going to prison and what it's like for people that go to prison and get out of prison and their struggle of trying to make it back into the world with not as much freedom as the average person, and so how hard it is to just find housing and find a job. But more than that, just his story is just incredible, and I highly recommend it to you. And then lastly is a book called Just Mercy, and this is my all-time favorite book. It is amazing. Bryan Stevenson is my biggest role model. He is a lawyer who created his own nonprofit organization to work with people who were sent to death row. And a lot of these people are kids. We're talking 13, 14 years old that are sentenced to life in prison or the electric chair. And a lot of these people, they weren't given fair trials. And usually it's because they're poor and they had lawyers that didn't really care about them. And so Bryan is able to look at their trials, and he realizes that a lot of these cases were pretty like the evidence was pretty weak, yet they were convicted guilty. And so he's able to reopen the cases and show that they were actually totally innocent, and that they should not be serving life in prison. They should be free. So he's able to get a lot of people free, and I don't want to ruin it, so I'll leave it at that. But it's just an incredible story. They made a movie already in 2020, just called Just Mercy, and that's with Michael B. Jordan, Jamie Foxx, and it's a really great movie, awesome movie. But at the same time, some books that are just like a 10 out of 10, you can't necessarily compare with a movie because the movie has to leave out a lot of things, and this book is just amazing. So even if you've seen the movie, I highly recommend the book. So that is my all-time top 10 favorite books. Highly recommend all 10 of those books. Feel free to recommend a book out to me if you watch this and have a book you think I should read. I appreciate it, and let me know if you end up reading one of these books and enjoy them. So that's it, and I hope that was interesting or helped. Thanks.